Yeah, welcome everyone. I see some familiar names and faces there. You're very welcome to this workshop with Alessandra Pauncz from Working with Perpetrators European Network. She's the executive director of that organization who works with, at a European level, programs working with male perpetrators of domestic violence and integrated partner support services. Alessandra's been working in the field of domestic violence for 20 years and has covered many areas in this field. She advocated and worked for victims of domestic abuse as a shelter worker, psychologist, researcher, manager, trainer, and in fundraising and consciousness raising at a local, provincial, regional, national, and European level. She founded and ran the first perpetrator program in Italy and set up the national Italian network for perpetrator programs. Additionally, Alessandra has published articles and books for the general public in the field. Also, have to say that since she's taken over the role in WWPEN, that there's been significant strides being made in the development of that organization and its tremendous support to members. So certainly here in Ireland, we've really experienced the impact of her time as the executive director and have worked very closely on certain projects with her. So really welcome her to this event and you all. And just to remind you, if you want to make any comments or questions, just put them in the chat bar and I'll try and keep an eye on them. Welcome, Alessandra.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for joining today. It's a great pleasure to be here today, to be doing this workshop, but also to have attended. I have attended the two keynotes and the workshops in the morning, and I find all the work that has been presented really, really interested and stimulating. So as for this workshop, sort of it's going to be kind of in between, in the sense that I do have some content that I want to share with you, and I'll be sharing some slides. However, since the topic of the workshop was really, really wide, I just tried to address many different aspects that I think are related with the trends and in the work with perpetrators of domestic violence. But I would be more than happy to sort of shape it on the interest of the attendants. So the reason I kept sort of a lot of different focuses is because the topic was broad and it's very hard to choose. They were all very relevant and interesting topics. But at the same time, if you feel like you would like to sort of discuss or ask questions or go more in depth on one of the topics that I am addressing or discussing, please feel free to even unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can ask in the chat box, and then we can maybe stop and focus more on one of the aspects. So without further ado, I will now share my slides. First of all, just a brief few words on the organization that I represent. As John was mentioning, the European Network is an organization that includes mostly members that are working with perpetrators of domestic violence, but also members that are working with women's support services, researchers. It also has the possibility for people to join on an individual basis as affiliates. And we have sort of various activities that we do. We have been an informal network since 2009, officially founded then in 2014. We currently have about 66 members, but our membership is growing constantly, so it's really hard to keep up, from 32 countries, and our main funder is the European Commission, the Oak Foundation. We have membership contributions, and over the last few years we also have been working on some pieces of researches with bids with UN Women, with the Irish government, and that has allowed us to actually start mapping some of the activities and the perpetrator programs both sort of the more consolidated ones on Europe, but also, and this is really, really interesting, the trends that are emerging in Western Balkans and in Eastern countries, where the idea of working with perpetrators is relatively new, but the whole topic of violence against women has sort of certain characteristics, and I'd love to get into that more because it's sort of been fascinating finding over the past couple of years. Our mission is to address violence in close relationships. We believe that this is gender-based phenomena, and after the amazing sort of really, really helpful presentation that Mike Flood gave this morning on what gender means, I think that that's a very clear sort of social constructs around how we believe we're women or men. We foster gender equality, so we think that combating violence against women is profoundly linked to also having gender equal societies. And the focus is the improving the safety of women and their children and others that are at risk of violence through obviously promoting effective work with perpetrators. When we talk about work with perpetrators, we do mean perpetrator programs, but we also mean, and that's something that I would like to sort of focus on in terms of trends and the ways in which I think we should develop and start thinking about perpetrator programs. Thinking about the accountability of the system, how thinking about perpetrators and how we address perpetrators has to be sort of structurally part of how we think about changing the system through men's accountability. So what are we doing and how do we do it? What kind of activities are we engaged in? Our main focus is obviously trying to find all the best practices throughout Europe and increasing the possibility for everybody to learn and enjoy from each other's practices. We do this through an annual conference, as this year is going to be in Dublin. We have study visits. Used to be one a year, but now we actually have also an online study visit, webinars, trainings, capacity buildings, and the trainings and the capacity buildings are very much based on needs basis. So based on our mappings and our findings on what perpetrator programs tell us. See, because we are a membership organization, because we have a close connection with our members, because I also am part of a perpetrator program in Florence, I'm part of the national network in Italy. The needs and the emerging trends and the issues that come up, the problems that arise for perpetrator programs are very close to our hearts and are very, we try and move as soon as we can when we sort of find and hear and see that there are issues coming up, like also happened with COVID, which I'll say a little bit more in just a few seconds. Policy, good practice recommendations. We have an annual campaign. There are a lot of resources on our website. So if you don't know our website, please check it out. Information on child protection. During COVID, there was all recommendations on how to work with COVID. There are expert papers on all tricky practice issues and practices around perpetrator programs. Supporting for shadow reporting, so also capacity building so that perpetrator programs can learn how to best address also national and international institutions, so as to make their work more visible and to gain support for this. We are also involved in evaluation of perpetrator programs, a European evaluation of perpetrator programs, which is the Impact Toolkit, which again, I hope I will be able to tell you something more, although the time is really clicking away. So we're going to have to probably select what we leave out. And then we are also always involved and engaged in different European projects that allow us to dig into and create materials for different topics. For example, now we're involved in a big project on prevention of stalkerware, which is the Stalk project. We were involved in a project that developed trainings and materials to train frontline professionals. It was Project Engage. So we're constantly looking for additional resources to create materials that are going to be helpful for our members. And last but not least is our next 4 to 8 year huge project, which is the development of a European accreditation system. And hopefully I'll have a little bit of time to also tell you about this, because I think that this is probably one of the most exciting new trends that we have around perpetrator programs in Europe. I'm not going to say anything more about the organization because we've said a lot about this. So I was going to start a little bit on what we have seen in terms of the effect of the pandemic on domestic violence in Europe, mostly because I think that we are still dealing with a lot of the aftermaths, and they're not really so after, because we're actually in the peak situation of a recurring pandemic. It seems like we've sort of decided we're going to manage it differently, but still the level of uncertainty and how this is impacting our lives, and also different forms of viruses that are developing, I think they are creating and influencing our lives still. And so I think that it's reasonable that in sort of looking at what the situation is right now, we kind of also look back on what the past couple of years are and what has been happening, especially because we know that there's been an increase of domestic violence, or an increase of the demand of services during the pandemic, and it stands to reason because given the enclosed situation, given the high levels of stress, but now we're dealing with the post-pandemic economic crisis, which obviously is going to play a factor also on domestic violence. So in terms of sort of the social wider context at a European level, and looking at sort of the trends, I think that looking at what the long-term effects of the pandemic are is really relevant for the work that we do. So again, these slides are all showing how there have been increased requests of demand for services, and both during the lockdown period and also after the restrictions were lifted. I know that in many cases, a lot of the, at least for perpetrator programs, a lot of the requests came as soon as the restrictions were lifted. But it doesn't really seem to have gone back. I mean, it really increased after the pandemic, but the levels at which the men are arriving are extremely high. And there hasn't really been an adjustment of governments and institutions in realizing that the clear impression that something has really changed and is changing. And this level of uncertainty within dynamics slightly linked to power and control, the situation of uncertainty has created a very risky area. So the impact obviously has been at multiple levels, both economic, as I was saying, virus-specific factors, everybody going a little bit phobic, and now sort of it seems like to be going back in the opposite direction. We're like in a peak of a new spread of the pandemic, but actually a lot of restrictions that would make a lot of sense, like sort of keeping masks in airplanes and things like that, are being lifted. So it doesn't make a lot of sense what was happening. and the counter-pandemic measures that make not much sense with this. So all these influence the actions of perpetrators. We know that with economic crisis, there's increase of alcohol consumption and many of the other coping mechanisms. I'm not going to go, and obviously then that has effects on the impact of victims, the children. So I'm not going to go into any more detail on this because we don't have that much time, and I want to give them a fuller global picture of what the trends are. But I did want to sort of take some time to highlight something that we have been a little bit too fast to dismiss and to sort of put in the past. I don't think it's in the past. I think there's still long term effects of what has happened. And I don't really think we're out. I think things are really still happening. So in general, when we talk about the prevalence of domestic violence, we know that we have a lot of gray areas in terms of what we know of what the incidence of the violence is. And this obviously has huge effects if we're looking on perpetration and perpetrator programs. We know we have sort of the official statistics, we have what the reported violence tells us is happening with the administrative data, and then we have the survey-based data, which is usually wider than that. But then there's also a huge area of undisclosed gray zone. And today I heard quite a bit the idea, and sort of was repeated many times, not all men are violent. And yes and no, in the sense, not all men are violent, but on the other hand, if we do say that there is a strong social construction that enhances a certain kind of masculinity, most men are going to be exposed to this. Obviously, not all of them are going to become physically violent, but most of them are going to be affected in different ways. And so also the way that we look at even the development of perpetrator programs should address from issues working with prison and probation, with men that have committed crimes, to men that arrive in different ways through social services that maybe have an in-between situation, to voluntary men that realize that they have a problem, but also the wider we can go in terms of doing preventive work and working with men around these topics. I mean, most of the men that arrive to the program, Iram and Florence, will say at the end of the program, all men should go through this program. I wish I had gone through this program when I was in high school. This should be mandatory in school. So I think that there's an acknowledgement also that there are conversations that need to be had around violence with men because of the social norms and constructions. So in order to contrast violence against women, and I put perpetration and working with perpetrators and creating the accountability of the system within the same framework, we need to create a chain of accountability that goes between laws passed, and I was mentioning before, Eastern Europe. There are countries in which domestic violence is not criminalized. So obviously we need to have a system that says this behavior is not okay. So we need to have law passed, but that's not really enough, because once the law is passed, we need people to feel, women and victims of violence, to feel empowered and to be able to press charges. And this is, for example, something with which the European Commission has been very engaged and involved. There's a new directive that has been developed, that has been developed by the Council of Europe and is now in the process of going through the Parliament, that has to do with looking at how low the number of women that are pressing charges are, and sort of remember sort of the gray numbers, and how to support and encourage that. How do we make the system more able to support and at the same time, this is not a directive, but hopefully it will be, because that's sort of the task that the European network is aiming at. seeing that if we want women to press charges and feel protected by the system, we need to hold the men accountable. And to hold the men accountable, we need to look at the perpetrator side of what is being done, how is it being done, who is looking into it, who's following up on that, how does the system become accountable to the victim about what the perpetrator is doing. And we cannot think about supporting victims without thinking about how we're going to hold the perpetrators accountable. This, I think, is one of the cultural shifts that we really need to look at and support to be able to develop better this chain of accountability. Once the legal charges are pressed, we'll have legal provisions. So the police will do things, the judges will or will not sentence the men to whatever the legal charges are, and then decide sanctions. So there will be a response, and then these sanctions have to be applied. So it's not enough. So it's passing the law is the very, very first step of what has to happen for there to be an accountable system. And what happens when the system isn't accountable? What is created is a cycle of non-accountability. Really, the next slide is the side of accountability. But here we have a situation, a system that does not recognize violence. And I mean, I won't even get into that, but what is happening in certain European countries on parental alienation is exactly this sort of backlashing of a patriarchal system that doesn't want to recognize violence. And so it's sort of a theorization of how women lie and how they are manipulated and how they're manipulative and they're trying to use the system against the fathers. In a system that does not recognize violence, women don't feel protected and encouraged, so they won't press charges. The system, therefore, doesn't see the violence. It doesn't protect. Women don't feel safe, and the system continues to not recognize violence. So in this circle of unaccountability, it's self-reinforcing. What we want to happen is that a system responds to protect the women, and the woman feels it's easier read the other way around. So the man commits violence, the system is able to respond, the woman feels safe because there's a system in place that's going to respond. She feels supported, she feels protected. At that point, she makes choices. She chooses to leave. She chooses to press charges, and the system responds to protect. So this is what we want to create. And as you see, the violence the men commit and the accountability that the system creates in responding to the violence is directly linked to women feeling safer and women being able to exit the cycle of violence. So that again, if we don't look at perpetrators' accountability and working with men in driving this accountability and working with systems in order to be able to ensure, because obviously accountability is much more than what single individual perpetrator programs are. They're part of a more system. But what perpetrator programs do is that they're posing the attention on perpetrators' accountability. So in this sense, they're really quite central. This is probably clear in a larger sense why perpetrator programs are important, but they also are interrupting the violence. They are attempting to break the intergenerational cycle of violence. And often they're important because women ask somebody to stop the violence and work with the perpetrators. In terms of the system, we pretty much covered that in all the first part of the presentation. So let's just have sort of a wide look of what perpetrator programs do and what the different things that are happening throughout Europe. So what does usually a perpetrator program do? Usually it has an initial phase that's an intake and assessment. During this assessment, there will be an evaluation of the risk factors and screening for the violence. Perpetrator programs should be directly linked also with women's support services, providing support for the victims of the perpetrators that arrive to the program, either with proactive contact with the program or with close collaboration with the women's support services. And then they will have either groups the men will be asked to join, or individual counseling, or sometimes a mix of both. So this in general is the scope of what perpetrator programs do in practice. How do men arrive in programs? And again, this is sort of a more general, what happens at a European level. Some arrive voluntarily. Certain countries only have voluntary programs, like for example, in the northern countries. They may arrive as part of measures from probation. They could be sent by child services or social services, or by a judge. Sometimes they are partner mandated. So the partner has given them an ultimatum in terms of the fact either they go to a program or they're going to leave. There are programs that are set within the probation system, and there are programs that are set within the prison settings. So as I was mentioning before, looking at the different levels of the violence, the severity of the typologies, it's also important to recognize that there are also different kinds of programs that need to be provided and set up. So how are these programs, what is the theoretical background that these programs apply? And again, we have a huge variation in Europe. We have a lot of programs that are more social educational, based on feminist models. So they have a very clear gendered structure in the work that they do. Some are more cognitive behavioral, although in many cases it's not either or, it's a mix of different parts of each of these models. So often they will be partly cognitive behavioral with certain techniques like taking a time out or teaching ways in which the men can manage their behavior so as not to be violent, and also social educational. There are more criminological models, and those are prevalent within child sexual offenders, a lot of sexual offenders, and very often within the prison setting. There are models of restorative justice, very often within the probation, especially in the Eastern countries. Probation in the Eastern countries is rather new, and so there's a whole trend of sort of innovative practices in restorative justice, also used in with domestic violence in Eastern countries. There are more psychotherapeutic models. Models that are looking more at sort of the individual makeup of different men, a little bit less at the social and educational or cultural aspects of violence. There are family models, and there are mental health and dependency models. So there are also people working on violence that are looking more specifically at the dependency model. Sometimes it's a mix of both. Sometimes, like in certain Eastern countries, there's the idea that whoever is violent, if you're a perpetrator of domestic violence, you have some mental health problem, and that's sort of the route that you should be going. Most of these models are top down. They sort of have been developed by the government and then just sort of passed on. They aren't really working because service providers aren't trained. They don't have extra resources, so nothing much is happening at the moment, but that is definitely an existing trend. As these family models are quite prevalent in Central Europe, Holland, Belgium, some of them are represented within the family justice centers, and in other cases, it's more based on centers that will provide services to the men, to the women, to the children, sometimes separately, sometimes together. So that really depends. Do perpetrator programs work? This links into the aspects I was discussing before on the evaluation of perpetrator program. I'm going to just stop a second before I go ahead, because I did say that I would have been open to sort of going in one direction or the other. I just want to check if there's some questions or comments along the way. Does somebody have any thing they want to add, or might are there any questions in the chat? Has just overslided everybody? Just do some mindfulness, where are you in your body now, sort of question about where to go next. Okay, well, just to remind you that please use the chat. Please stop me at any time if you would like me to or if you have a comment, or if there are sort of questions, I will be happy to sort of stop. Otherwise, I will continue zipping through this sort of extensive overview of sort of trends and what's happening in perpetrator programs. So, evaluation of perpetrator program. This has been sort of an ongoing question since sort of the beginning of time of perpetrator programs, because there's a huge question around, does it work? Are we wasting our resources on perpetrator program? So partly, I would say that one of the considerations I want to premise with have to do with the whole, everything that I've set up to now around the system. So in some ways, even if perpetrator programs didn't work very well, it would make a lot of sense to have perpetrator programs, because it is part of how the system makes the perpetrators accountable and focuses on attention on what is happening with the perpetrators. So I think that the question around working with perpetrators and sort of focusing on perpetrators is much wider and has to do with a general accountability issue. The good news is that actually, although it's extremely complex to evaluate in any social arena, if something is effective or is working, the evidence that we now have around perpetrator programs is really promising. Obviously, there have been a lot of questions, and there still are a lot of questions to sort of sift through. When we ask, does a perpetrator program work? What is it that we want to measure? Do we want to measure recidivism rates? Okay. If we do want to measure recidivism, so has that man that's gone through the program been violent again? How are we going to measure this? Is it going to be through rearrest or reoffense? And those of you that are familiar with the literature around evaluation of perpetrator programs know that in many cases that's the element that we are measuring on this. But we also know that many men don't get rearrested, even if they have been violent again. So then how do we measure the reoffense? Do we measure it based on what the service provider sees? Or do we measure it based on what the offender says? Or do we measure it based on what the partner or ex-partner says? So obviously, this is going to influence the answers that we get, but also the data that we have to collect around the understanding of what perpetrator programs are. So with the controversial data on the outcomes of program are mostly linked to what's being measured, from who are we taking these measurements, So is it like all the men enrolled in the program? Is the men that finished the program? And how we measure the reoffense. What has sort of become quite central after the 2018 research that was done in the UK by the Mirabel Project is that in order to define measures of success, we need to look not only at the physical violence, but we need to look at the expanded space for action, the victims. We need to include what the effects, what the impact, as our toolkit is, what the impact of the violence is, and has that improved over time? So we want to look at, is the relationship improved? Does the victim feel an expanded space for action? Does she feel more safe, and does she have more freedom from the violence and abuse? Is there safe and positive shared parenting? Is there an enhanced awareness of self and others, as the workshop this morning was mentioning just how crucial it is in learning how to manage violence, self-awareness. So obviously this has to increase and create better childhoods for the children that are involved in the programs. Within this framework, impact, which again is a very long-term project of the network. We started with the mapping and sort of understanding of the evaluation programs back in 2018, and ever since there's been sort of the striving to develop. The ambition is of developing a European tool to be able to compare programs throughout Europe with the same collection of data and with an approach that goes and looks at the specific impact that the violence has and how perpetrator programs are able to support and help men change their behavior and the consequences of the violence. So with the impact measures, we are looking at behavior change, safety, well-being of the victim and of the men, changes in the life of children, attitude changes in the male participants, and perceived changes as a result of being in the program. The data is collected at 4 times as soon as the man is in the program, beginning, mid, end of program, and a follow-up after 6 months. And the information is collected both by the men that are in the group and by the partner or ex-partners. These are some of the outcomes that we had from some of the research and giving sort of really positive changes between the beginning and the end, and on a very many different levels. As you see, it's so that it makes it particularly helpful and useful for perpetrator programs that are going through the evaluation, because it's not only about how the men's behavior has changed, but it's also the specific areas in which it's changed more or less. So it actually gives you indication for your own program of what you might have to strengthen in terms of working with the men, what is going better and what is not. So it's a very sort of helpful tool. And so again, I think we have 10 more minutes, and I would be more than happy to stop for a question and answers. I think I'll just sort of wrap it up, maybe rapidly, few more minutes, and then we can sort of open it up to discussion. But if there's something pressing, I'm willing to stop now. Okay, so given the overview that we've seen, what do we know about what works? So we know that the coordinated community response is really important. So the social response is central, and again, the system needs to respond. The men are part of a system. If the whole system isn't giving the same messaging, it's very hard for an individual, organization, or group to be able to make a difference. We need strong links with the women's support services, and we need feedback from victims of domestic violence as to hold the perpetrator programs accountable and to always sort of keep the safety of victims and children, of women and children at the core of what we do. We need to recognize that there are different kinds of perpetrators, high versus low risk, court mandated, voluntary, in prison or probation settings and outreach programs. So we have a variety of levels in which men are engaging in violent behavior, and we need to be able to have also different tools to be able to work with them. We need the programs to be victim-centered and gender-informed. We need to look at, again, different ways of responding depending on the level of risk and on the specific needs of every perpetrator. We need relationships built with the men. We need to base that on trust, and we need to build motivation. And we need programs that are trauma-informed. As Gary was mentioning before, we can't ignore the impact that violence has on the lives of men and how that conditions violence. Just as a very brief example, we are currently working with the Ukraine women's UN Women based in the country. We were preparing a program on fathering before the war broke out. But immediately after the breakout of the war, we started reflecting and thinking about the connections between domestic violence and veterans of the war. And we know that there's a strong link there. It's happened in other conflicts in the Eastern countries. And there's nothing, and it's a very complicated issue because, again, it has to do with masculinities, with principles of sort of protecting the country, being in arms, and a lot of violences that increase against women within that framework, and with traumatized men that have been sort of severed of all their ties and that have had extremely brutal and traumatic experiences, and so how that links in. So it's ongoing and transforming what we work on, how we work on, but this is definitely something that we need to account about. Okay, I think I'm going to stop here because otherwise we only have at least this we have 5 minutes to discuss. I'll just leave you my last slide on the resources, our website. Although I didn't put the link to the website. That wasn't brilliant. Okay, so it's Work with Perpetrators EU. I mean, all you have to do is European Network of Work with Perpetrators, and you'll find the website. So questions or comments or, oh, there it is. Sorry. Then one slide. So I've lost everybody. So are there?
Sorry, Alessandra, just from a kind of a personal point of view, I'm just thinking you did mention you might just say, if nobody's other questions about the accreditation process, is it okay to talk? I mean, if somebody else has another question, but for me, I'm just interested in your thinking about that, how that's going and what might happen.
Yeah, okay. So the accreditation process of perpetrator programs is sort of something that we've been thinking about for quite a long time. There aren't many countries that have been able to develop an accreditation system. We have Respect in the UK, we have the BAG, which is the national network in Germany. But apart from these two examples, we don't really have that many examples of this. And so basically, there is really no way of knowing exactly what perpetrator programs are doing, how they're doing it, except for what they say of themselves, which is okay, but it's not particularly objective. Also because with doing the mapping and with working with different organizations throughout Europe, we see that very often it's very difficult to be one's own evaluator. People think that they're doing certain things. They think that they're doing sort of a gender-informed program. They think that they're doing certain things, but sometimes they think they're doing risk assessment. Very recently, I was visiting a program and I asked to see their risk assessment tools, and it was an intake form. And I said, well, this is an intake form. There are no risk indicators. And they said, but it says risk assessment. And our trainer at the beginning of the training said it was a risk assessment. So, I mean, sometimes people in good faith think they're doing certain things and they're doing other things. So, and some of these practices are really dangerous. So again, sort of saying and developing something that is centered on making sure that victims of violence are safe means stepping up a bit our game and really being able to say something more about what the programs in Europe are doing. So the idea around accreditation comes from that. And then we get into sort of the complexity of how are we going to work with different legal systems? How are we going to work with different even cultural understandings, different models that I was saying before. So that is definitely sort of part of the work in progress. But the first sort of step of this accreditation process is around transforming the guidelines for standards that WWP developed in standards to work. So that's basically the first year of the accreditation. This year we've been working sort of on thinking about the model and how are we going to develop this system that is going to be on the one hand able to really look in depth into things, but also to be flexible depending on different cultural contexts. And then next year, we're going to be working on the standards going forward in that direction. Obviously, this makes sense if we are doing it with our members and working with members so that they can go through and be accredited, because it's very nice to have sort of ideal standards, but if that's not sort of happening in practice, it's empty. And obviously,
sorry, Alessandra, apologies for interrupting you. The live event was due to go, or sorry, the final session was due to go live a minute ago. We're just wondering if you could start wrapping up, please, because we'd like to go live in the next minute.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So, yeah, a lot of exciting things that are happening, but then sort of the very interesting part was that so the question remaining was around the resources, because we know accreditation is a very expensive process, but this is sort of have been ideally resolved by the EU, that has actually asked us to step up and reallocate resources to our members. So that's sort of perfectly aligned with the ideas around accreditation. So thank you very much. And I think we're going to have to all swiftly.
Thanks, Alessandra.
But I mean, I think my email was at the beginning, or I can sort of leave it in the chat. And anybody that has any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out and ask me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alessandra, and thanks everybody for joining. We'll head to the next session. Thanks again. Bye, everyone.
Bye.